Hello, everyone. Welcome. Hello, Melody. How are
Hi.
you? Hi, Graham. How are you?
Well, thank you. Yourself?
Good, good.
Hmm, Just having
Um,
afternoon tea, excuse me.
uh, that's okay. Um, so we'll just give a couple of minutes for everybody to come in. And
Hello, Lynn. Hello, Louise.
Hello.
Millie.
If you do just want to take a minute to put in the chat where you're calling from and what drew you to this conversation, which part of collaboration, cooperation, uh, reluctance is yours, it would be great to just know where you are and what you're thinking. And maybe, yeah, the conversation is being recorded, just so you know. The recording will be shared. Hello, Mike. Nice to see you. And if you please use the chat liberally all the way through. If you want to highlight any issues, questions, responses, we will pick those up when we open to the floor. But in the meantime, I'm going to actually hand over to Kirsten. I think you all know we are joined by Kirsten Dunlop from Climate Kick, Adam Kahane, whose past book and soon to be second version, Collaborating with the Enemy, and Fabian, who is from the Together Institute, all represent, for me certainly at least, the different parts of collaboration and cooperation, which is what drew us to this conversation. I'm just going to pin everybody. And Kirsten, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Tamsin, and welcome everybody. I am going to do a little scene setting, and that's also for Adam and Fabian. So this is a live experiment in collaborating online in a conversation together about collaboration. And then we're going to manage the time with about 45 minutes of discussion, of kind of talking amongst, particularly really digging into the experience of Adam and Fabian and the common connections amongst us, and then open up for widening that discussion to everybody on the line. So if you have, as you have questions, put them in the chat. I have the chat open, and then we can start to weave them through. My name is Kirsten Dunlop. I lead an organization called Climate Kick. I've been here for 8 years, and I came from a number of quite fundamentally different career steps, career building blocks, with a red thread on reading across. My life has always been about not quite belonging, living in liminal zones, reading across, making connections, and very often crossing thresholds simply because someone who saw something in me that I may or may not have seen in myself opened a door, and it was just too enticing not to cross over. So in many ways, this conversation is going to be about some of those acts of crossing over and getting into liminal zones to find ways to working with one another. So I'm going to make one kind of overarching connection. On this call are a couple of people, Adam actually representing one of the organizations who are working at the moment in a living experiment of collaborating, fundamentally, structurally different way to the way in which we have in our lives often been induced or trained or rewarded for acting. So that part of what we are doing is live in this conversation and may well come into it. It's an initiative called the Collaborative for Systemic Climate Action, in which Climate Kick and Rios are both involved. Adam has published 2 books this year, which, as far as I'm concerned, in my busy life, where even writing LinkedIn posts destroys my whole weekend, means I just have my hat off. But one of the things I want to dig into is the way in which he has done that, which has very much modeled a lot of what we're going to discuss. And Fabian, I am discovering, lives and works just up the road from where I live and work, which means this is an unexpected encounter that I should have known about years ago. So there's a whole lot of negative and interesting empty space to step into. So you've got 3 discussion partners coming from different perspectives of practice, knowledge, experience, and contact points. And I'm going to start, Adam and Fabian, by asking, what is one thing that most people on this call would not know, or that many people in the world would not know about you personally, that explains why the topic of collaboration is of such keen interest to you? So I'm interested in what is it that kind of builds your story here, and I'm going to give you a little bit of time just to think about that, but it may not be well known or well seen. And I have about, this is a kind of an expectation setting, I have about 6 questions on this whole topic, angling in particularly on the context in which we're in, the overarching framework of the idea that this might be a topic in a context that isn't necessarily automatic, the notion of reluctance, of difficulty, either reluctance of will or reluctance of institutional arrangements and habits and expectations that make cooperation and collaboration very, very different. So it's not just a topic per se, it's a topic in context and a topic in framing that is asking us as a group to think about what are the extra deeper dimensions that we need to reach for, the connections we need to make, the ways in which we need to understand limiting factors or enabling constraints. So this is a good way, a good topic for this particular time, I think, when all sorts of unusual allies and unusual bedfellows are having to find one another quickly. So I hope I've given you enough time, Fabian, Adam, for introducing yourselves with some element in your journey here that people may not know about you. Who wants to go first? Fabian, you ready? Let's start with you.
Sure, I'm happy to. Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you, Tamsin, for organizing, and thanks for being here, everyone. My name is Fabian Pfortmüller. I'm originally from Switzerland, living in the Netherlands now, and I see myself as a community weaver. I help groups come together around a shared purpose, and I help them to thrive over long periods of time. And my interest around the topic of collaboration is particularly influenced by, I started many different communities, but one in particular called Sandbox, which started in 2007 with the intention to bring young change makers together from all over the world to help them to collaborate. And what I realized was that my expectations around collaboration were unrealistic. That I was hoping, I was bringing these young people, amazing young people together in quite a beautiful spaces and allowing them to create deep connections. Yet the collaborations didn't happen. At least didn't happen in the short term. And I've been since reflecting on like what are the conditions that are necessary for groups not just to come together, but really to collaborate. And yeah, I'm very curious to unpack that together also today. I run now an organization called the Together Institute, where we work with nonprofits and foundations to help them with their communities and with their networks to come together around collaboration, around shared purpose. So maybe that's just a little starting point, and maybe with that I can pass it to you, Adam.
Thank you very much, Adam.
Well, thank you. I know this will sound like the thing you have to say, but what I'm about to say is related to my answer, which is that I'm happy to see you, Kirsten, and also several other very old friends, or I should say maybe friends from very long ago. So that's a happy, unexpected thing for me. So most of my experience in collaboration and how I got into it is not something people don't know about me, because I've written about it over and over. So if I was to try to say something that you don't know, which I think is important and true. It's that I generally like doing things on my own, and I'm not at all a good team player, or not usually a good team player, and am an introvert, and so it's a real stretch for me. But I think the reason that's true is I think that's what blew my mind, or blew the hinges off the door when I first got involved in 34 years ago in the kind of very intense collaboration among people that don't think they can work together and find they do, and it's often for them and for me one of the most beautiful experiences of our lives. And I think that's what got me hooked 34 years ago in South Africa, and then in many other places since then.
Thank you very much, Adam. If I apply that question to myself, I actually, remarkable resonance. I'm also somebody who kind of grew up in ways where self-reliance was kind of a survival skill, and that turned into a strength, but that has dark sides to it. And I remember when I was trying to, so the probably lesser known or not known thing about me is I got into fights with institutions a lot. And one of the first institutions, the second institution that I got into a really major fight was with Sydney University, that insisted on the fact that I could not study all the subjects that I wanted to study. And it practically did that by just scheduling them all at the same time. And I had a very significant fight about the meaning purpose of humanities as a faculty, and how you could possibly not allow people to study a lot of different things. And as I was loudly railing about this, a professor in the University of English, in the Faculty of English, asked me why I was complaining so much. When I explained, he offered for me to send a tape recorder to the entire curriculum for 4 years that I couldn't do because I was doing archaeology and ancient history and fine arts and so on. So I did a parallel degree invisibly through a tape recorder in addition to the one I did. And he taught me so much about gift giving as an act of creating trust, relationship, of opening up possibilities of things that you would never see. And it's just one of those things that I has kind of repeated over and over. It is always for me, and has been, about understanding the leap of faith it's like stepping off the edge of the Grand Canyon, and with the blind faith that the floor of the valley will rise up to meet you. And there's something about that underpins the reason why I am very keen on this topic. So thank you both. Let's take this conversation forward. I think one thing that is probably important, given the years of your expertise and study on this, Adam, and given the years of practice expertise in bringing, as you might say, bringing a horse to water, but not necessarily having him drink, Fabian. Let's do a little defining. How would you both define the essence of collaboration? In a European context, very often, sometimes, or an American to European, the word cooperation and collaboration are used interchangeably. In a European context, that causes all sorts of immune system reactions because of the language of cooperation of the Vichy government, the cooperation with the Nazi regime. So it's interesting, even now, I still get told, oh, we don't want to use the word cooperation. That's not right. Or collaborator is also got lots of strings attached. I would love to kind of get to the essence of how would you both name what is essential about this in what it is that we are talking about.
So I love writing and I love words, and I was saying to a writer friend of mine the other day, one of my favorite parts of it is I get to look things up in dictionaries 4 or 5 times a day. And some words are so important in what I'm writing, including what I'm about to say about collaboration, that I force myself to use the dictionary definition. And to avoid cheating, I don't allow myself to go to different dictionaries to find the definition I like. I have one, a 1984 edition of the Concise Oxford, which I forced myself to use their definition so as not to cheat. And for me, this is important, and it was brought up in Tamzin in one of the articles you circulated, I think, a week or two ago. You know, people have all kinds of ideas about what things mean, but the dictionary definition of collaboration and cooperation is the same thing. It means the first definition of collaboration, which is the word I use, is to work jointly with. I think it's collaborare or something like that. So I don't, and I'll say something second. And the reason that's important to me is that people make up a lot of additional meanings about why it's different from all these other things and why it involves this and why it involves that, which is fine. But I'm interested just in the basic phenomena of working jointly with, without any necessary qualification. I think that's hard enough, just working jointly with. You don't need to add and self-transformation and system transformation and. So I'm always trying to get down to the essence. I was a very poor physics student, but all I took away from that is this desire to explain things in the simplest possible terms. Now, in the Concise Oxford, there is a second meaning of the word collaboration, which is the one you've alluded to. It means to betray. And yes, I guess you talk to different French speakers than I do. The word that I understand to be very problematic in French is collaboration or collabo. But I think that double meaning is not an accident or not a distraction. It gets to the difficulty. My main conclusion about collaboration, and you excuse me for being pedantic about it, but I have been thinking about nothing else for 7 months, so I have lots of opinions about it. But I think the reason it's not straightforward and not nearly as easy as people who make up titles for conferences about collaborating for this or collaborating for that. The reason it's not easy is because collaborating across difference, or which means collaborating with anybody, because there's always some difference, always runs the risk of I think I want to work with you, I need to work with you to do this thing I'm trying to do, or for whatever reason, we can get into that. And I worry that to do so would require me to betray that something's important to me, that would require me to compromise. Somebody told me in Thailand, collaboration means you agree with me. So that's a common misunderstanding. The double meaning of collaboration in the Concise Oxford to me, is not an accident. It gets to the heart of why we're reluctant. We're reluctant because we're worried we'll give something up, something very important. And especially in French, but also in English, there is actually nothing worse than being a collabo. Somebody pointed out to me, it's worse than being an enemy because you're betraying your own people.
Thank you. That's fantastic in scene setting and context setting. Fabian, how would you?
I just lost Kirsten for a quick second, but now
Yeah,
I
I'm
can
just passing to you the same question. What is the essence of collaboration in your experience?
Well, I thought what Adam said was really powerful, and I don't have much to add to that at this point. I think it's very clear. As he was talking about definitions, I was reminded of a good friend of mine, David Che, uses the definition for how do you measure success of relationships, which is often a big part of what communities are about. And his definition is to what degree am I being changed? And for me, that kind of draws a nice parallel between what you were saying on collaboration and relationships. How do we know these relationships are meaningful, quote unquote meaningful? What does meaningful mean? Well, to what degree are they changing us?
That opens up a whole other topic of entanglement, and how does working together really start to open up into existential, epistemological, ontological questions of who you are, what is the boundary between one and another. Fabian, maybe if I just can I ask you, your work and your positioning refers to weaving. How do you relate that framing to this discussion?
Yeah, maybe as a starting point, when I started working with communities 20 years ago, I used to call myself a community builder. And over the last, especially 10 years, as we are here talking about words, I started to shift my language because I realized that communities and maybe even collaborations, I imagine, are not something that can be built. Uses a mechanical engineering metaphor. Let's build it. And instead, I realized that I had to change my own mindset and in the language that I was using, in the metaphors that I was using, to something that was acknowledging that I was working with a living, breathing organism. It's not a machine, it's a flock of birds. It's not it's not an engine, it's a rainforest with all the different elements in it. And inspired by, how Kirsten was talking about entanglement, how everything is entangled by everything actually in life. Weaving felt just like a much more appropriate metaphor and perspective. And I see my role as a community weaver is to help groups weave a web of relationships, to entangle the people as much as possible. And I think when it comes to collaboration in particular, what I've learned is that collaborations need at least in kind of the cases that I've worked on, need a long period of time to unfold. And how do I make sure that this web of relationships stays healthy and is there in a consistent way to then let these entanglement kind of unfold the way they're supposed to? I don't know if this answers your question, Kirsten, but that's what's
It
coming.
does, and it actually gives me a wonderful segue then into a next question that I wanted to ask you. There's a couple of things. I want to look at two sides of this, but I want to start. Let's start with unpacking instances, experiences, the human stories of this. Adam, you have the Radical Collaboration Playbook that you launched during the COP at Sharm el-Sheikh, was constructed with the input, the experiences of people who are trying things on the ground. And your latest book has done exactly the same thing, I think, taken that to the next level again. Can you bring to life, what are the examples, the stories within that process of building out a picture of understanding? What does collaboration look like? Why did you add the word radical for someone who shares a passion like you of definitions and Latin, Greek, and other language roots? There's so much that can be said about the relationship between radical and collaboration. Stories that have really stuck with you in building those pictures of extraordinary experiences of collaboration, the kind of stories that would inspire anybody to want to try doing something similar.
So you're not asking about stories about the writing of those texts, but about the underlying. Yeah.
I'm asking what good looks like.
Yeah. Well, I'll give the example I always give, with apologies to those who've heard it 15 times, but I guess, well, I think it's a good example, and it had a very big influence on me, and it relates to something that many of you know about, which is my very first experience with this kind of work, which was in South Africa in 1991. I'm from Canada, but I was at that time working in London, with a methodology called scenario planning, and there were some South African academics that wanted to use the scenario methodology to think about the transition from apartheid to democracy. For those of you who don't have South African chronology at your fingertips, Nelson Mandela was released from prison on February 2nd, 1990, but the first all-race elections were not held until April 27th, 1994. And so I went to South Africa for the first time and had the experience I'm about to tell you about right in the middle of that. And because most of us think about more recent events or know how the story unfolded from there, we forget that at the time, 1991, almost nobody outside of South Africa or inside of South Africa thought that a peaceful transition was possible. There was still violent conflict. There was still parties that had not laid down their arms. The apartheid and colonialism had gone on for so long that it seemed impossible. And when this project, which became known as the Montfleur scenario exercise, named after the conference center where it took place, was being organized, I made just one suggestion that a colleague of mine in London, Vince Cable, made to me. The scenario work I've been involved in all involved people from the same organization, maybe with some consultants or academics involved. But Vince said to me in his very English way, they should suggest to them that they invite some awkward sods, meaning people who thought about things differently, and they did. And so what was remarkable about that exercise, to make a long story short, is that it included a few academics, but not many, but mostly leaders of different parts of South African society, politicians from the left and right, opposition and establishment, men and women, business people, trade unionists, community leaders, entrepreneurs, etc. And this was the first time I had ever encountered what we'd now call a multi-stakeholder leadership group. And I just couldn't believe what was happening. I couldn't believe that such a group of people who, in many cases, had been in prison or in exile or underground, who had been in a really serious conflict for a long time, who had a lot of reasons to truly hate each other, not imaginary reasons that somebody stepped on my foot, but to hate and fear each other. That such a group was able to work together very constructively and creatively and with a lot of joking around. I thought this was just amazing. And the way I've sometimes described it is it was like the experience of a dark night where you have a bolt of lightning that temporarily or momentarily illuminates the scenery and then you can't see anymore. So I'm saying that because I understood something then that took me many years to understand what it was and how to do it. But that moment of seeing it is possible, as I would now say it, it is possible for people that don't agree with or like or trust each other, including people who see each other as enemies, to get stuff done together in all of their disagreements. and we could come back to this later, but it didn't happen through them agreeing on things, or at least not on many things, but it came from them having the experience of working together. And yeah, the reason I've told this story so many times, apologies for those of you who've heard it, is because for me it's emblematic of this work. There was a joke I heard on that first trip to South Africa, was that faced with our unbelievable challenges, we have really just two options. There's a practical option, which is we right now all get down on our knees and pray for a band of angels to come down and solve this problem for us. The miraculous solution is that we continue to argue and fight and try stuff out, find a way forward together. And I've always liked that joke, because that's what South Africans did. And anyhow, for those of you who know the rest of that story, I never went back, which is why I'm taking this call again from South Africa, from the home of me and my wife, who was the organizer of that project. So in all respects, a successful project, and has inspired me for the last 34 years.
And that joke is immensely appropriate to the problem we have with climate change right now. Thank you, Adam. So, Fabian, let me come to you. You were referring, when you were introducing, about the experience of having brought a group of change makers together and then finding that they just wouldn't actually do what you were hoping would be the obvious outcome of all being working together. So do you have experience? What has the most extraordinary, game-changing, life-changing experience been for you in seeing collaboration working well?
Yeah, maybe my story picks up where Adam left it off, with him meeting his wife at that collaboration point, which is that this particular community started in 2007. And again, like, we didn't see real collaboration the first few years, but now, with being able to zoom out over 18 years, an enormous amount of collaboration has happened. But what, for a while one of my success metrics became to how many weddings I get invited that were both sandboxers. And I can proudly say I've been to 5 of those weddings. For me, that was just, that is an ultimate collaboration. Someone who, commits very deeply to each other, of course, on a very personal level. But what I saw over long periods of time is that when people come together around a shared purpose, if there's consistency in rhythm, when there's strong shared values, at least in my experience, and I'd be curious how Adam sees that, but in our experience, in very unexpected ways, when a lot of different elements, a lot of different factors align with each other, people will collaborate in various ways, but it's very, very hard to predict that. And I never have predicted all that has happened. Because again, just so many factors had to align. From they had to have time, they had to be interested in the same thing, they had to have the same, I know, maybe risk appetite, they had to have the same values, they had to be maybe in a similar stage of life. And a core lesson that I learned with Sandbox was that if you bring change leaders together, that it's actually quite hard to get them to collaborate, because by definition, leaders very often have their own project or their own projects that they're bringing in. That's why often they are invited. And if we expect them to collaborate, do we mean we hope them to collaborate on their existing projects, or are we expecting them to start something new, something in addition to what they do? I think that's one of the big mistakes, that we were expecting that people would create new things, additional things. But really what our job was to make sure that people could truly just bring whatever their personal interest, their agendas was, and allow them to gently, slowly align them over time.
So this is indeed
Um,
one of those. Sorry, go on, Adam. Go.
Yeah, so I want to jump in here because there's something in the introductory call that caught my attention, and it relates to a question. If you don't mind, I'd like to ask you, Kirsten. So that you can come back to your, if that's okay.
Of course.
So what Fabian said interested me because I do think that something that works very well and is not hard to organize is bring energetic change makers together and have them get to know each other, and then lots of interesting things will happen. And I think that's valuable and not too hard to pull off, but of limited impact, or it can be limited impact. I'm not commenting on Fabian's work. I don't know it well at all. But I think there's a very common misunderstanding in this work that I think that's to me a real problem, and it arose I interpreted it as arising in the preparatory call we had for this, which is somebody said the challenge is to get from me to we. And I think this is completely incorrect. It's unrealistic. It will almost never happen. And if that's what you expect to happen, you will be disappointed and frustrated and give up. And this is a soapbox. Mila will have, my colleague Mila will have heard me rant about this probably 200 times, but I think it's important, and it will bring me to the question I want to ask you, Kirsten. And the short version of the rant is collaboration is always about multiple wholes, WHOLES. So people always have their own projects or ambitions or organizations or things that they're trying to do in their life or in the world. That's not an incidental thing. That's 100% of the time thing. And they'll almost never abandon those. So one of my pet peeves is when people, usually facilitators, say, let's think of the whole, they almost always mean the whole that matters to me. And so for me, the key, I'll say it so strongly because this is what I've been writing about. The key to understanding how collaboration works and to getting it work is to realize you will always have the power of each component and the connection among the components, what I call power and love, and that the nature of the relationship, which I call justice. So anyway, sorry. Now, when I last saw you, Kirsten, I don't know whether this is a good name drop or a bad name drop, but when we were together in Davos, you made a very interesting comment about this phenomena. You said that it's like a T, like the letter T, that you were thinking of the collaboration that you were involved in, or that we're involved in with you, the Systemic Climate Action Collaborative, as being like a T, in that you are respecting or acknowledging or seeing the identity of the constituent organizations. You weren't expecting them to dissolve their ambitions or boundaries or needs, or for that matter, budgets and hierarchy, but you saw the potential for them to collaborate across those silos. So I wrote that down, T, because I think it's a very helpful image. And it gets around this idea that's implicit in most of the conversation about collaboration, which is what we have to do is abandon our individual interests in service of, quote, the larger whole, which usually means the collaboration or something larger. I'll just say one last thing. When my son got married, which I think was about 10 years ago, it's a bad idea to have a father who's just finished writing a book, invited to give a book on. I wrote a book called Power and Love. But I said something brief that I still think was very helpful. I said to him, I hope that you will become one, you and your wife Olivia, that you will become one, and that you will become properly two. That I was gently, well, warning him would be too strong a word, but advising him not to imagine that marrying means we lose our separate selves. And it's always interested me that in English, the word we use for peacemaking is often coexistence, but in Spanish they use the word convivencia, which I think strictly speaking means cohabitation or living together, but it's the same word used for a couple that lives together. And I think it's a very helpful image. You wouldn't say I'm coexisting with my spouse, or if you did, it's a bit of a grim word to use, but to say we're living together, this immediately, at least in my limited experience, I've only been married once, suggests all the ups and downs of agreement and disagreement and beauty and tears, etc., etc. So anyhow, I finished now with the soapbox, but I'm interested in how you think about that key, because I think it's an interesting metaphor.
Well, thank you. I think there's probably two things. One is it's a metaphor that comes from the necessity of experience. I run over all of the kind of different instances of leading organizations and contexts whose reality has been to work out how to understand and occupy a constantly changing relationship between a sense of identity and a context. And that relationship, that perpetually fluid, perpetually mutually adjusting relationship between one's identity and the context, whether the one is individual, familial, community, national, organizational, business, and the changing context, for me, is the essence of meaning. Meaning is the exchange, is the weaving together of those two things. And the reason why I find, and I am so deeply interested in quantum thinking and quantum philosophy, is precisely for this notion of entanglement, that we begin to have a language to name the state changes that happen in a dynamic relationship on both sides. So for me, every piece of work I've ever done has been a relationship between a lot of kind of deep contextual work that has inherency in its context and the meaning that derives from that, and what I would describe as a cultural historian of negative space. If you study sculpture, you never look only at the form of the sculpture, you look also at the form of the spaces created by where there is air around it. So if you study cities, you go and look, especially medieval and Renaissance cities, you don't just look at what the buildings are, you look at how they have created negative space, public space, because it's often the largest single investment that they make. They carve out a huge amount of space. And that relationship between what you do and what you can't quite glimpse at or feel the edges of or see the possibility of, which is about what others are doing and what you would learn from doing with or connecting in with what others are doing or doing in different places, that's the horizontal bar, the analogy of the horizontal bar of the T. And for me, the essence of learning how to work together with others is to work that relationship between what you know, what you inquire, what is meaningful, and the glimpses of possibility and of becoming a larger self, which is not the same as becoming a we, but becoming a larger collection of selves because of your entanglement with the work of others in a sort of field space. So much of the work that I have done for years with my partner, who leads Cora Foundation, Luca Gatti, is on the idea of let's not talk about platforms where you flow a thing across and transact through it, but as space forms forms of space and spaciousness that allow for this positive and negative charge, that allow for this entanglement to take place and continuously reconfigure. That's the essence, in my mind, of the collaborative that we're involved in building, which gives it the kind of, as you were describing, Fabian, living system. These are living systems of a capacity to meaning make, shape shift, identity shift in relationship to a constantly changing context. If we build anything that doesn't come up with that, then it's just not, it's not living, and it's therefore not robust enough to survive and thrive. So yes, I fundamentally agree with you. It's one of the kind of fallacies of... Now, what I find fascinating about the work that we're doing in the collaborative right now is exactly this point where you feel a social system as a codification of social practice, not a living system, but a social system that starts to ossify. You know, in our case, we've just taken on money and we've started to distribute it, and you can feel this sort of slight ossification around how do we bring on new partners? And that little bit of ossification around, well, now we'll need to really carefully codify that and work out what the agreements are. And it's interesting because it's just losing ever so slightly the grip on inhabiting fluidity and inhabiting the risk-taking of that kind of fluid exchange and entanglement, and allowing that to be genuinely organic. And I think it will change. It's like you even our ability to notice that opens up to the possibility of refluidifying the way in which we understand expanding our own relationships. But I think the relationship between consciousness systems and social systems, and the way we tend to try and design them. We try to design them. I often wonder whether one of the things we need to keep coming back to is the DNA stranding of difference between nomadic and settled peoples. Because that fundamental stranding keeps us oscillating between the desire to kind of lock, own, kind of categorize, and the desire to be fluid.
Yeah. So I hesitate to use biological metaphors because I did very badly in high school biology. But what I think in this work, where all of the challenges are about polarities rather than choices, wholes and parts, etc. I would just put a question mark beside the idea of ossification being a bad thing.
Yeah, it's a habit.
Yeah, but I guess we need fluidity, and we need our bones and our solidity. So they're both required, and I find it's certainly in my own thinking, I move so easily into this is good and this is bad, and it's almost always a mistake. And it's the big change in the new edition of Collaborating with the Enemy, is to realize that what I wrote off as conventional collaboration in the first edition is actually a very helpful way of working in certain contexts.
And that actually leads me to something that I wanted to ask you both, and kind of take the conversation to unconscious Tamsin just for time. I'm going to run this for another 10 minutes, and then we're going to start weaving in the questions that are in the chat or comments. Because I think your point, absolutely, that polarity matters enormously. This is a spectrum of constant weaving. It's why I loved your metaphor of weaving. You're constantly not just weaving strands that lock, but actually dancing in between different states. The question I am asking myself and want to ask to both of you is, how does the current context change the way we collaborate? Why, with whom, and how? Because the current context, I mean, and I'm not going to go into the many, many qualifications of how we would describe what is happening in the world right now. I'm going to leave it to you to decide which piece of that you want to grab and run into this conversation with. But how does the current context, or how might it change what we define, how we name, how we do, with whom?
Adam, would you like to go first?
Please go ahead, Fabian.
That's one of those moves in an Anglo-Saxon world where someone says, "Would you like to go first?" and then they get offered it back.
Yeah.
It's a very English move.
Thank you. I consider that a compliment.
Look of you.
Well, I mean, one question I think Adam before mentioned what I took as a very healthy provocation around, when we bring people together around shared purpose, things happen, but is it useful? And I think that's a really important question. And I do think in a lot of initiatives, collaboration, partnerships, networks, communities that are explicitly around collaborating around some shared purpose or some better future, my experience, collaborations do not really happen, or much less happen than they could. And I think a lot of that has to do that, again, this is just my very singular and very limited perspective to compare to the wealth of experience that many of you bring here, is that people are just so much there still with their own agendas that are kept undercover. And yes, I agree with the multiple holes. I think it's our opportunity to invite multiple holes at all times. And I wonder if, as we are starting to sense more urgency, that we're becoming more willing to collaborate, that we're becoming more willing to actually align our priorities beyond our individual agendas. And I think there's a lot of, in so many collaborations, in so many collaborative environments, I still see people in the end pursuing their own agendas. And at what point do we become willing to compromise, to, be changed by the other? And I do think there is quite a difference between, if you're in a post-conflict environment where it's very clear what the challenge is you're trying to overcome versus something very abstract like climate. How do we really align our energies around something that feels abstract, that might not feel that urgent, that's very intellectual for some people? So yeah, I do hope that there's a sense of urgency that makes people more willing to actually align agendas. Adam, what do you think?
I want to build
well,
a question into
sorry.
there, Adam, just to carry a question in towards you. One of the things I wonder about is the experience. What creates the experience that opens up that sense of why and how or what to do? So there's partly a question of experience and partly a question of intention. But let me lay that there and pass to you, Adam, on this core question of what changes what in the context changes how we do this.
Well, I have two answers to that question, but I just want to make one comment on what Fabian said. When I was a shallow university student, I was very good at reading the back cover of books and having enough to carry on at a party. And so I haven't read Machiavelli's The Prince, but I did read it. Back cover of an excellent edition. And what stood out in my mind is this particular translator or interpreter said that you won't go wrong betting on power or on self-interest. So, Fabian, I would just say you'll never go wrong betting on, in my opinion, in my experience, you'll never go wrong betting on own agendas. And the idea that people would leave their agendas at the door, to me, is their agenda might change or evolve, or they might review it or see it in a different way. But the idea of leaving one's agenda at the door, to me, is a non-starter and is closely related to what I said earlier about power, love, and justice. Now, On your main question, Kirsten, I would say two things. The first is that the way I understand our current situation is that collaborating is becoming increasingly important and increasingly difficult. And that poses I'm not sure if this is exactly the right analogy, but it's an irresistible force and an immovable object. There's really a crisis because we need to work together more. And I think there's many signs that we have less capacity to do so, or another way to say it is increasing enemifying, increasing othering, increasing retreating in the midst of crisis to defending a smaller whole rather than a bigger whole. So I don't, yes, I think they're both true. It's increasingly necessary, increasingly important. And hence the question of, well, how do you square that circle? I can add another metaphor. And I have some ideas about that. But I think there's another point which is obvious, but that I have been overlooking until very recently, which is often we are collaborating with others against still others. And so to say we're in favor of collaboration is usually a nonsensical statement. So to take what I understand, maybe I'm misinterpreting it, the Systemic Climate Action Collaborative, you have an audacious objective to create a collaboration among a wonderful group of organizations, but in order to, or at least that's my understanding implicitly, in order to be more effective in fighting against another reality which has people behind it. So, so yes, you're collaborating, but in order to be stronger to effect change or to overpower, if I can just simplify a little bit, the status quo. So this is important because I think the most positive outcome of the current crisis, and I'm speaking now as a Canadian, and more dread for my country than I ever have in my life. I think the optimistic interpretation scenario is that the danger, in this case, the danger from our neighbors to the south, as we call them, will cause us to collaborate amongst ourselves or with our European brothers and sisters or others in order to be stronger to not collaborate or to resist or fight or the people who are harming us or trying to harm us. So anyway, so yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, so this is actually one of the things I was wondering around it, and it goes a little bit to this notion of negative capacity or negative space. You know, what would green populism look like? How would you imagine extreme kind of, how would you imagine really bringing the cocktail of collaborare in the middle with those with whom you are least likely to agree, and not as the far right and the far left in Germany currently agreeing on the fact they both love Putin, and so that's fine, but something that is a constructive space of intentionality. So I think that where my question would go next is what... It comes back to this question of both intention and experience. My experience is similar to yours. Never, ever, and as a deep reader of Machiavelli's, there's a whole long conversation to have about the Prince, actually, because it's in very many ways what Machiavelli was writing about is exactly what you are describing, which is that if you own the need of individual agents to be in pursuing a course of power relationships embedded in absolutely everything. The question is, is it kind of mutually reinforcing power and love, or is it mutually reducing power and violence? Then there's something that you can do to design with the experience of multiple interests coming together and tapping into something significantly greater than the sum of the whole, and experiencing physically, somatically, intellectually, cognitively, kind of neurologically what that does. And literally the way in which, if you sing, when you sing in a choir, if you really finally get the harmonics right, you feel like the skull of your brain literally dissolves and you can suddenly start to feel, but you haven't become the same as everybody else. You are feeling literally the experience of something that is a whole greater than the sum of the parts. And one of the questions I'm wondering about is there something we need to do fundamentally different now, is really, really invest in giving people an experience of what this means. Not necessarily with like-minded individuals. And it sort of cycles back a little bit to the original Montfleur situation that you were describing. How do you give people an experience of something that is not with the people they are sharing a common purpose with, but may potentially have very different purposes, but tap into or experience something that expands the space of possibility for all? And that I would love. There's a question there I have around the intentionality that we bring in what we are doing. I am going to kind of stop myself from going further and translating that into a sense of further questions, and just pick up some of the questions in the chat, but also open up for anybody who would like to ask a question or put a question or a reflection into this discussion. So please use your hand if you want. There is a question I saw back here. Yes, from Godelive, who I think has had to leave, yes. And also a question from Sean McKierney, whose name I think I have just mispronounced. So this notion around intentional, I'm noticing a delicious tension between a commitment to collaboration and the challenge it holds to put into practice. I guess this means we need to become really intentional. If so, what is collaboration asking of us? And that question of what is the intention, the shaping of intention, the shaping of the naming of intention, the way in which intention itself, like the anthropologist's dilemma, kind of changes, as you say, Fabian, kind of creates the opportunity for everyone to be changed by that intention evolving over time, or entangling people in it. And questions here around, are we collaborating here on the formats of interaction now which dominate our lives, or are we pondering on collaboration because we no longer really, in the worlds in which we find ourselves, do that? So some questions, whomever, Fabian or Adam, would like to engage with this. And as others wish to speak, please prepare and put your hand up. What do we do with the experience that kind of expands people's sense of what this is? What do we do with intention in the context in which we are at the moment, in this collapsing space of smaller holes? Fabian and Adam, while you are thinking, anyone who would like to jump in and reflect on those questions?
Well, let me just say something very briefly. I don't think I understand the question you asked, but I would just say two things that go in opposite directions. One, the experience of collaborating across difference is easy to manufacture. In this work, there's almost nothing that could be guaranteed, but I do think the experience of connectedness and entanglement and shared humanity is it occurs 90% of the time if you organize the gathering well. And one of the examples I'd give, and that has always fascinated me, is years ago, somebody taught me a method for a paired walk, where when you're in a group which is diverse or maybe contains people that really don't agree with or like or trust each other, you at a certain point say, well, we've been talking for several days or hours now. We have lunch in 45 minutes. I just invite you to look around the room, find the person most different from you, and go for a walk. And it's always interested me that people almost always say that was the best part of the workshop. Could we just have fewer things with plenary speakers and post-it notes and flip charts? Could we just have another walk? Because that was really useful. And so I wondered, what was it about the walk that makes it always powerful? And a Mexican theologian named Lucida Cerviche, who had experienced the walk, told me, here's the thing, Adam, it's the order that's important. When you're going for a walk with somebody and chatting about the workshop or life or your family or whatever, you are, of course, going through the world together, encountering it, making decisions, etc. But the crucial thing is you are meeting first as fellow human beings, and then maybe as a result of that, you will change your relationship or your action or your thoughts, at least a little bit. He said that's the opposite of the traditional Catholic confessional, where first you have to admit that you have sinned, and then you can be readmitted to the communion. So I think this idea of, it's really simple, just as simple as I've said it, but the idea that we are here as fellow human beings and we will encounter each other as such, and then we'll see what happens, that this really works, and it always works. Now, here's the problem. I think these days, there may be many contexts where people are more reluctant to join in the first place because of polarization, social media, enemifying, the thought that, well, I don't have to talk to them, I can defeat them. So that, for me, I think the solution's easy. It's just getting harder to organize, I think, or at least in some contexts.
In my organization, we have one of the principles of what we do is a inversion of the usual phrase of where there's a will, there's a way, to where there's a way, there's a will. And we have that embedded because a lot of our work is about creating the mechanics of working in fundamentally different structural ways so that people discover that that's possible. And when the rails of the system are in, they start using them. And once they start using them, they start to discover that the things are possible with them, and they start to like them and get used to them. And all of a sudden, systemic change and collaborative practices start to happen. And I wonder about proxies. So what are the proxies that we could put in place? Experience proxies, method proxies, process proxies that have people doing a thing or tapping into a thing without necessarily buying into any of the ideology of it, that isn't, however, just a superficial or cynical exercise. There is some kind of space making that opens up as a result. And maybe there's a large part of what we need to be doing right now that is exactly that, proxying. So it's interesting, I was reflecting on what you were saying about the collaborative that we are both involved in now, is that created in a polarity with others who sit behind a system. And I don't know, I think actually it's created in polarity with something that John Ralston Saul described as the abdication of agency in the world that we've created, where we use the capital markets management as this kind of universalized system out there that has no humans in it. It's running itself. It's actually been created in a kind of a dialogue with that, a little bit like the Buckminster Fuller version of things, build something different and make it so irresistibly enjoyable that others will come. So I want to pick up on this question of intention, because I noticed Samantha Wacky is also asking the same thing. What is the intention that we are describing or that we are implying? Samantha, do you want to speak to that? why are we, what's the religion we're implying here?
Actually use the right word, religion, because that's it exactly. One of the things I've noticed is we don't have shared values anymore in the same way that we used to in the past, and a lot of our shared values came from shared religion, and it's non-existent. And so when we talk about a goal or an end game, in terms of where we're taking the group to, as the facilitator, as the one facilitating the collaboration, I don't think that has come out for me clearly, because a lot of the things that we will assume we have in common, we no longer have in common. So that would be one. And then two, because I'm in a different part of the world, I have this challenge when I come into groups where there's you mentioned it at some point just in passing as a joke, where you said that's an Anglo-Saxon something. It was just in passing as a joke. So I probably have more exposure. I might be able to understand what you're saying. I might be able to keep tracking with a conversation. But where I come from, a lot of people don't have that context. So there's a whole westernized context that is used a lot in these spaces. And maybe I will catch up because I can put in the effort, but you will lock out, if you're doing it in my part of the world, you'll lock out a large number of people. So in a simple way, where are we taking them? What is our role? What is the end game? Why are we bringing the people together?
And how would you name the same question? What is the essence and purpose of collaboration from a non-West, or from let's not kind of do big categorizations of Western, non-Western. From the places in which you feel most grounded, how would you describe the essence and the purpose?
Okay, I'll say two things. One, there's a statement that came out, and you were the ones, I think you said it, a whole greater than the sum of the parts. So I think that to me is big. It's bake a bigger pie, bake a bigger cake. Let's come together. Let's have more, strength in numbers. But what is increasingly very important to me is also to get back to the right path. I think that's very important to me. And so how I approach it in my context is we have wisdom that we've always had, ancient wisdom, indigenous wisdom. And how can we get us all back to the place where we are reading from the same page, which is that foundational wisdom.
So interestingly, I have a question there around one of the principles that we are exploring in the collaborative that Adam and I have been discussing is to introduce or literally code in symbiosis as a reference system for the way in which we then would design in relationship incentives and so on. And coming from a place of just pragmatism, really, on understanding that these are codependent relationships that mutually serve the interests of both or of many, and that the sum total of many multi-sided codependent relationships serve the interests of a greater whole and of getting to a sense of a greater whole. And I think, but I want to ask, for me, there is a mirroring in that as one of the absolute essences of indigenous and ecological wisdoms of understanding the pragmatism of codependence and the life-giving properties of designing for and working with codependence.
I like that. I think that's my answer. It's the pragmatism of codependence. It's something we forget that we're entangled. I think you've been using the word a lot, entangled. So that makes sense. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Samantha. Mille, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I've been sitting with something that relates a little bit to what Samantha was speaking about tangentially, but I think we're talking a lot about the different perspectives and the different points of view and divergent interests and so on, but we're not talking that much about the different power levels that are involved in the collaboration, and it adds a whole different layer of complexity. to our work. And I think part of why the Systemic Climate Action Collaborative is working well is because there is more or less 15 organizations that are not that different from each other in size, not that different from each other in sort of the balance of desperation and resourcefulness. And there's an ability to work together in that way. But when you add significant power imbalances, it that really changes. It's a different situation. And when we talk about the fluidity and the structure, I think we sometimes forget that fluidity is very comfortable for the people with most power in a certain group. And as a leader of a diverse team, which includes people from different classes and different backgrounds and so on, I know that the people who most need the structure are the people who are not the most privileged on the team, for example. So I think we need to, when you talk about the changing context, I think one of the things that's changing about our context, besides Trump and climate change and AI and so on, is that power is also out of the bag in a way. Like we've gotten away in the past with the definition of collaboration being you collaborate with me for the people with most power, and that's not going down any longer, you know. So we have to learn to collaborate across different power levels in a new way, and we have to acknowledge different forms of power and invite in different forms of power and so on. And so I just want to bring that into the conversation because I feel like we're missing that dimension of diversity, and it's something that we really need to lean into to learning how to navigate.
Thank you, Mila. That's super helpful. I would love to build with that on a further question, but I'm going to bring Tamsin in next, or Jerry, whichever is a Jerry.
It's Jerry. Yes, sorry, I apologize. I just can't resist. Thank you, Samantha, for what you asked. And I just wonder if there's an ingredient missing. I believe a lot in the power of reciprocity, that it sort of guides practically everything. So it's one thing to collaborate with the enemy if you are agreeing to a set of reciprocal responsibilities, so to speak, whether it's values, whether it's that you're both wanting peace in South Africa and you don't want violence, and so that in the end game, there is a reciprocal kind of give and take. It's quite different if the people you're trying to negotiate with or collaborate with don't share any sense of reciprocity with you. They don't share that. And I assume that there's a difference between two kinds of collaboration. I'm not saying you can't collaborate with somebody you don't agree with, but maybe both of you have to have a certain degree of acceptance of where you want to get to. And if you start without that, do you have a chance of collaboration? So in a way, you know, your climate collaboration, it's because there is a shared sort of sense of responsibility of what you're about. You're sharing something. I don't want to use the word values, but I'm just throwing this out, and I'm really particularly interested in hearing what you think about reciprocity, because it hasn't been mentioned.
Fabian, do you want to pick that one up?
I see Adam unmuted, so I'd love to invite Adam.
Okay, thank you. So I guess the only point I'd make with respect to these last two comments is that collaboration is most straightforward when there is not too big of a power differential. If I can get what I want without collaborating with you, and anyhow I don't really want to collaborate with you, then I won't. Or it'll be a sham, a pretend collaboration. So certainly I think that reciprocity and reciprocity primarily, and the ability to work across power differences or different kinds of power that results from reciprocity is great. But I keep coming back to what if you don't have it? What do you do then? Well, you can say, okay, then I'm not going to collaborate. I'm just going to try to get my people together to defeat those people that are doing things I don't want and not willing to operate with the reciprocity I expect. I haven't mentioned on this call, but Mila and others know that I worked for a long time in the country of Colombia, including during the among the combatants during the Civil War. And one of the people who was involved in that work over more than 20 years is Juan Manuel Santos, who later became president and made a peace with the FARC, and for which he got the Nobel Peace Prize. And to make a long story short, he's spoken warmly about the work we did together, which I appreciated, but I never understood why. And a few years ago, I conducted a public interview of him, and this was the first question I asked him, which is, why do you keep mentioning these workshops that we organized together? It was so long ago, so much bigger things have happened. And he gave a very interesting answer. He said, I mention them because this is the first time I realized that it is possible to work with people you do not agree with and will never agree with. So I think this is very interesting. This idea, well, we have a disagreement, but we're going to have a walk, we're going to have a drink at the bar, we're going to find actually it was all terrible misunderstanding. We want the same thing, we share values, we're willing to be reciprocal. That would be, I mean, I'd prefer that, but what do you do if you don't have that? And the example he gave was very interesting. It was the example of him and Hugo Chavez, because when they met, when Chavez was president of Venezuela and Santos of Colombia, it was obvious that they would never agree. One was a revolutionary socialist, and the other was a neoliberal conservative. And yet they were presidents of neighboring countries and had things they had to do together. So reciprocity, shared values, shared understanding, shared problem diagnosis, ability to work across power differentials, all of this is very helpful. And how do we work together when some or all of those ingredients are absent?
Which is, of course, the million-dollar question for the next 4 years.
For example,
I think the question is also emerging for me around if we pay a lot of attention to symbiosis in nature, how do our discourses about power hold? The relationship between insects and elephants, symbiotic relationships. How would you define power in that? Because you could easily type yourself fast into assuming that the bigger, larger animal that can squash anything is more powerful. So I think there's also a question around power over, power with, power through. How are we defining it? How are we substantiating it? How are we conducting it? How do we play it? Because we may also be kind of partly limiting the space in which we can act together with others by hanging on to something that we are using as a shorthand to describe inequalities, but not necessarily looking for what's the whole that's bigger outside the edges that kind of expands the space for everyone. The other question I have is, and I'm going to use this as a way of kind of wrapping up. I want to build and pick up on what you were just saying there, Adam. When do we stop? What are the signposts at which point we say enough?
Fabian?
I don't understand the question, Kirsten. Could you?
When would you stop? What signposts would you say? So it's a little bit related to what Samantha is also asking. Is Is this an infinite teleos? Are we infinitely working towards the idea that this is the flag on the hill, this is the light, this is the, this is what we're aiming for? Or what are the points, the break points, the boundary breaks, the points at which you say enough? Now, it could be, as Adam has been describing it, you get to that point where your version of collaboration, your expectations, your intention has to do with reciprocity or similarity or sharing of purpose of outcome. And if that's not there, that's the line you draw. If you don't draw a line there, if you're stretching into the space of working together, finding ways to do something, no matter whether values are shared or not, then what is there a next boundary? Is there a point at which that breaks, or we would naturally wish to draw it? And think of collaborations in no man's lands in the middle of war. Like, where are there red lines and boundaries where we would say this is flipped over into a dark side? I'm sure we have lots of answers to that, but I'm interested in what comes up through this conversation. Parasitic symbiosis.
I don't think I'm answering your question, Kirsten, but in the spirit of where we are at the conversation right now, I could just tell you like how I'm making sense of, for me, what came up through this conversation has been one of framing of like, how do we frame the invitation into collaboration? And I see a tension which came up several times today, which is, in the end of the day, is the intention to bring people together into deep relationship and alignment of, as we're moving towards a world that is just more and more connected, and the symbiosis, the interbeing where we all are one? Or are we moving to solve specific problems, specific challenges that we need to like collaborate on? And for me, for me, that matters both in terms of the framing and the invitation, but also like where we draw the boundaries.
And do we see that as the polarity, a spectrum, the same polarity, the two ends of the same spectrum, or are these somehow orthogonal? Adam, do you want to make just a reflection, and then I'll close out?
Yes, just to say that I don't think the choice to collaborate is a once-off choice. I think in practice, we can and do move between collaborating and forcing, adapting, and exiting, what I call the other three alternatives, often. And I would say we don't collaborate when we think it's not worthwhile, not helping us get where we're trying to go. However, I have come to the view that there is not a priori a red line. That the question of, do I need to work with these people? It depends. To do what, when, how, in what context? In fact, and this raises a whole other question, I'll just leave it hanging. I think the biggest obstacle is the idea that there is a red line, that there's black and white, there's friends and enemies. My dear colleague Zaid Hassan warned me when I published a book called Collaborating with the Enemy that I was unwittingly parroting Carl Schmitt, the famous Nazi political scientist and jurist who believed that the way to do politics was friends and enemies. And so I took that challenge seriously. Well, it did take me 10 years to take it seriously, but anyhow, I eventually took it seriously. And I think a more helpful idea is not that it's black and white, but that it is a large gray area. And the challenge we have is to navigate in this large gray area.
Thank you. I think what I want to then bring in to close out is, and first of all, thank you very much, Adam, and thank you, Fabian, for curiosity, generosity, and a willingness to really just move with the flow and see where the conversation took us. I think that kind of notion of a large gray area, exactly, if I take what you have both been saying in different ways, Adam, this notion of when you start to define an intention of collaboration or a practice of collaborating, you are defining it in relationship to something that you're not collaborating with, which in some ways is, the flip side of that is you are always in collaboration with something. You are always in an entangled relationship with something. It's a question of how you draw that boundary around what your intention is and who's involved in it. And the last element I would bring in just to close us out is to remember that we are physical beings as well as cognitive beings. One of the most powerful experiences I have had of a experience building towards the possibility of working together differently was working with a remarkable woman in Australia who trains actors, getting a group of people who had never worked together and never known of one another, come and hum as in loud, at different tones, touching their heads to one another. And I'm talking 30 people. And there is a completely extraordinary shift in a sense of connectedness, but also a sense of something that reaches beyond that. So there's probably something I think for me is still hanging around. There's a somatics in this, not just a cognitive element, and understanding a bit more about the chemical signals, the somatics, the physical nature of the way in which this creates a whole bigger than the sum of the parts is probably where we really might need to reach for in the next little while. I'm going to stop there and hand back to you, Tamsin. Thank you very, very much for the license to play. And thank you, Fabian and Adam, for an absolutely mind-stretching conversation I need to go and reflect upon.
Thank you, Kirsten. Yeah, thank you all three of you. I knew this was going to happen. It was very provocative, and I'm sure everybody joins me in saying thank you. A lot to reflect on. So very grateful. Thanks everyone for joining.